Renew your mind. You have heard that phrase in every sermon, every journal, every New Year resolution list of your entire life. But the actual command behind those words is not asking you to do the one thing you have been doing for years. It might actually be forbidding it. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you will not read Romans 12:2 the same way again. This is not a translation error either. Nobody mistranslated a word. The words are all correct on the page. What got lost is not vocabulary. It is grammar. The one part of a sentence a reader almost never questions. Here is the sentence. Everyone quotes, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Two commands, back to back. Everyone remembers the second one. Almost no one asks what language Paul is actually using underneath it. And that is exactly where this gets interesting. Start with the word transformed. In Greek, it is metamorphosth, and grammatically, it sits in the passive voice. Not active, passive. That is not a small grammatical footnote. It is the hinge. The entire verse swings on. Active voice means you perform the action. Passive voice means the action is performed on you. Be transformed does not mean transform yourself. It is closer to be healed than to be disciplined. Nobody heals themselves by trying harder to heal. Right there, the whole verse stops being a to-do list. So if you are not the one doing the transforming, what exactly is Paul asking of you? That question is the entire video, and Paul does not answer it right away. He makes you wait, and the waiting is the point. It helps to understand why the active voice reading spread so widely in the first place, because it did not happen by accident. English translation naturally smooths passive constructions into something that reads more like a direct instruction, since be transformed sounds, to an English ear trained on self-help language, exactly like a command to perform an action rather than receive one. Add a self-improvement culture that already rewards effort as the highest virtue, and a verse about receiving transformation gets quietly reread as a verse about achieving it. Nobody set out to mistranslate anything. The grammar simply got flattened by a culture that could not imagine any other kind of command. Before chapter 12, there are 11 chapters. 11 chapters of Paul building one single argument, that no one earns their way into God's favor, that it is given before it is deserved, not by good behavior, not by cleaning yourself up first, not by any performance metric a first-century reader could have pointed to. Only after 11 chapters of that does chapter 12 open with the word therefore. Not therefore, now, go earn it. Therefore, in view of mercy already received, that word order is not decoration. It is the whole structure of the command. Obedience that follows grace is not the same transaction as obedience that tries to purchase it, and Paul is careful never to let his readers confuse the two. This matters more than it sounds like it does, because most modern readers approach this verse backwards. We open Romans 12:2, the way we open a productivity book, looking for the technique, skipping straight to the instruction. Paul does not let you skip. He makes the reader sit through 11 chapters of undeserved mercy first, on purpose, so that by the time the command finally arrives, it cannot be mistaken for a transaction. There is also a word in the verse right before this one that almost never gets its own explanation, and it changes how the whole command lands. Paul asks for a living sacrifice, not a dead one. Every sacrifice a first-century reader had ever seen was an animal that stopped living the moment it was offered. Paul flips the entire image. The offering he is describing keeps breathing, keeps walking around, keeps making decisions the next morning. That is a strange thing to ask for. A dead sacrifice only has to be surrendered once. A living one has to keep choosing to stay on the altar every single day, which is exactly the posture the rest of the verse is about to describe. No, this is not a checklist verse. It never was. It is a description of an ongoing posture, not a task completed once and filed away. Now here is where most people stop paying attention. Right when the actual content starts. Do not be conformed. uses a different Greek word entirely, syschematizeste, built on the noun schema. Schema means an outward shape, a pattern pressed on something from the outside. It is where a much later language eventually gets the word schematic, a blueprint imposed on a thing, rather than grown from inside it. Transformed uses morphe, an internal, essential form, the kind of change where the whole internal structure is different, not just the surface. Clay pressed into a mold is schema. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly is morphe. One is imposed from without. One is grown from within. Paul is not asking which behaviors you should change. He is asking which direction the change is coming from. That distinction is not ancient trivia sitting in a dusty lexicon. It describes exactly what a recommendation algorithm does to a person. Watch one video, and within days your feed has quietly reshaped what outrages you, what you compare yourself to, what feels normal, without a single conscious decision on your part at any point in the process. That is schema, in real time, on the device in your pocket right now. Paul was not writing this in a vacuum either. Rome in the 1st century ran almost entirely on schema. Status was performed in public, on the street, in the forum, through clothing, through processions, through who you were seen standing next to. Historians of the period describe an empire obsessed with visible rank, where a person's entire identity could be read off their outward presentation before they said a single word. Paul's readers did not need this explained to them the way we do. They lived inside a culture built entirely out of imposed outward patterns, 2,000 years before anyone owned a screen, and the mechanism driving it has not changed nearly as much as we like to think it has. Here is the twist most teaching on this verse never mentions. The mind Paul says needs renewing is not what most people assume it means. Renewing your mind sounds like sharper thinking, better logic, being smarter about your decisions. The Greek word is nous, and nous does not primarily mean intelligence. It means perception, the lens a person interprets everything through before a single conscious thought even forms. Nobody scrolling at midnight consciously decides to become more anxious in the process. An hour later they simply are, because their nous absorbed 100 small comparisons without ever asking permission first. Nothing about their intelligence changed in that hour. Their lens did, quietly, underneath conscious awareness. This is also where a lot of English translations quietly mislead readers without meaning to. Renew sounds like a spa word, a self-care word, something you schedule. It is not describing a Tuesday afternoon reset. It is describing which lens is doing your seeing in the first place. Long before you ever get to a single decision, ancient Greek philosophy already used nous, long before Paul ever picked up a pen, to describe the faculty a person perceives and interprets reality with, not simply the muscle they calculate math with. Paul is borrowing a word his readers already understood as the deepest interpretive part of a person, the part that decides what counts as normal before any single choice is ever consciously made. That is a far bigger claim than swap out a few negative thoughts for positive ones. It is closer to. The entire interpretive machinery underneath your choices needs replacing, not adjusting. Quick mid-video marker, because this is exactly where the verse usually gets misquoted. The worst. And it is worth pausing on. If any part of this is already reframing something you thought you fully understood, that is precisely the point where I would genuinely want to hear it in the comments. Because that reaction is usually the sign the old reading is finally cracking open. Subscribing means the next root word breakdown actually reaches you, instead of getting buried by an algorithm doing exactly what we just described a few minutes ago. Back to the text. Because the twist gets bigger from here. The word for renewing is anakainosis, and Greek has a completely separate word, neos, reserved for something that is simply new in time, a newer copy of the same old thing, like a newer car with the same engine. Anakainosis is built on kainos, new in kind, a different category of thing altogether, not an upgraded version of the old one, not a patch, not a maintenance update. According to standard Greek reference, works like Vine's Expository Dictionary and the Standard Lexicon BDAG, this is the same root family used elsewhere in the New Testament for new creation language, not renovation language. Paul is not describing a mind getting a few features installed on top of the old operating system. He is describing an entirely different operating system, replacing the old one at the root level. Sit with that for a second, because it quietly reframes almost every self-improvement instinct a modern reader brings to this verse. Self-improvement assumes the existing system basically works and just needs better inputs. Anakainosis assumes the existing system was never going to get you there, no matter how good the inputs became. That is a much bigger claim than most sermons let this word carry. Here is the full circle, and it is the actual reason this verse ends the way it does. Rather than simply stopping at renewal, go back to chapter 1 for one moment. Paul describes people handed over to a debased mind, autokimos in the Greek, a word that literally means failed the test, disqualified, like metal pulled from a furnace that could not survive the fire and had to be discarded. By chapter 12, he flips the very same root, dokimazo, to test something and find it genuine. That is not a coincidence. Buried 11 chapters apart, same word, family, opposite outcome, deliberately placed on either end of Paul's entire argument. The mind that once failed the test can, through this renewal, become the mind that recognizes truth almost on sight. The way gold that has already passed through fire does not need to guess anymore whether it is real. Hold on to that word, dokimazo, for one more second, because it explains something a lot of Christians quietly feel guilty about and should not. Discernment, in this verse, is not presented as a personality trait some people are naturally born with, and others are not. It is presented as the direct output of renewal, something that develops the same way a tested metal develops reliability, through repeated exposure to fire rather than through a single moment of insight. Nobody is disqualified from ever developing it. The furnace is simply still running. Now here is the actual twist this whole video has been building toward. The one detail almost nobody connects, and it is sitting in plain sight the entire time. Metamorphosed, the exact same Greek verb, translated be, transformed in Romans 12:2, appears in exactly one other place in the entire New Testament. On a mountain, in front of 3 witnesses, Jesus is transfigured. Sama word, sama root, same grammatical shape. Matthew records that his face shone like the sun, and that light was not switched on from outside him like a spotlight aimed at a stage. It broke out from within, because it had been there the entire time, and for one brief moment, on that mountain, everyone standing there finally saw what was already true underneath. In plain sight the whole time. That is what Paul is telling every tired, ordinary reader of Romans 12:2, and it is worth sitting with before moving on. This was never a productivity system with a Bible verse stapled onto it. It is light that already exists inside a person being allowed, slowly and repeatedly, to become visible. The same way it became visible on that mountain in front of 3 witnesses who never expected to see it. Read that sentence back to yourself, because it is almost nothing like what most of us were quietly taught this verse meant growing up. Paul makes this exact connection explicit elsewhere, writing that believers are being changed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another, using a form of the same word family again. That is not a coincidence. He left buried in a footnote. He is describing the mountain scene as the pattern, not the exception. Something meant to eventually characterize an ordinary life, rather than a single, unrepeatable event witnessed by 3 people 2,000 years ago. The mountain was never the ceiling. It was the preview. So what does this actually change on an ordinary day? The kind with no mountain and no obvious light. Not a single dramatic decision made once and then filed away. Repeated exposure to something true, instead of repeated exposure to the feed. Not forcing a feeling that is not there. Not gritting your teeth into gratitude at 2 a.m. because a verse told you to stay. Positioning yourself, again and again, In the places where the light Paul is describing can actually reach you, the same way a plant is never yelled into growing faster. It is only ever positioned toward the sun and left there. This also means renewal was never meant to be private, even though most of us were taught to picture it that way. Alone with a journal, alone with a highlighter, alone in a parking lot. The living sacrifice language a few verses earlier sits inside a passage that immediately moves into the body of believers functioning together. Different gifts, same body. Whatever renewal is doing to your individual lens, Paul assumes it is also going to reshape how you actually show up for the people around you, not just how you feel on the inside during a quiet moment. A renewed nous that never changes how you treat another person has not finished what this verse is describing. One more thing before the takeaways, because it answers the question this video opened with directly. Being transformed and having your mind renewed are not two separate assignments running on two separate tracks. Anakainosis is how metamorphosy actually happens. The lens changing is not a side effect of the transformation. It is the mechanism of it. Ask for the second without the first, and you get behavior modification that burns out by February. Get the first, and the second follows naturally. The way light follows a lens that has finally been cleaned off after years of buildup. 3 things worth carrying out of this whole study. First, to be transformed is passive, not active. So the job was never to manufacture your own change through sheer will, only to stay positioned where it can happen to you. The way a seed stays positioned in soil, it did not create. Second, renewing your mind is not clever thinking. It is anakainosis, a genuinely new lens grown from the inside, rather than a pattern pressed on from the outside. Third, the goal was never private self-improvement measured against yourself. It was dokimazo, a mind that recognizes what is good and acceptable and perfect almost on sight. And the same way light simply broke through on a mountain and revealed what had been true the entire time. So the title of this video was not clickbait. This verse really does say close to the opposite of how it usually gets quoted. Once the grammar is actually accounted for, instead of smoothed over, you are not failing this verse by still feeling stuck today. You may have simply been reading a passive command as if it were an active one, for years, without anyone ever pointing out the grammar underneath it. That is the whole reframe this video was built around. From the very first sentence to this one, none of this makes the command optional. And that is worth being precise about before this ends. Because passive is not the same word as passive in the way we use it casually to mean uninvolved or checked out. Paul still says, be transformed. It is still an imperative. Still, something Rome's readers were expected to actually obey. Not a passive suggestion they could quietly ignore while waiting for feeling to arrive on its own. The passive voice does not remove responsibility, it relocates it. Your responsibility was never to generate the transformation yourself. It was to keep showing up to the place transformation happens. The way a person still has to walk into a hospital, even though they are not the one performing the surgery. If this changed how you read Romans 12:2, say so in the comments. Because that reaction is genuinely how these studies get sharper over time. And it is the single fastest way to tell me which verse to break open next. Subscribe if you want the next root word breakdown to actually reach you instead of disappearing into a feed built to bury it. Share this with the one person you know who has spent years trying to think their way into a new mind instead of resting into one. Because odds are, they have never heard the word passive attached to this verse either. Pray for this channel, and for whoever needed this tonight more than they expected to when they clicked play. God bless you.